Hello YouTubers, my name's Willie and welcome to my channel. Today I have for you Reaction Request 210. This is Mechanicum Part 1, part of Arch Warhammer's lore breakdown series for the Horus Heresy books. This was originally requested by CJ Falcon, so let's check this out. Play. Bum, bum. Bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. Greetings
and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet another Horus Heresy lore video, where we give a little bit of a breakdown of the various interesting lore tidbits in the Horus Heresy book series. Today we are on book 9, Mechanicum. And this one has a fair few interesting tidbits, especially as it pertains to the Emperor and the Mechanicus in the 30k universe. So, right off the bat, we start with the Emperor arriving on Mars. And the timing of his arrival was no doubt meticulously planned, because there was a prophecy pertaining to the Omnissiah and his own arrival on Mars. He would do so on the highest point of the Red Planet on a particular plateau, and his arrival would be heralded by a rain, along with a very particular stellar pattern with Mars moons fixed in very specific areas. Now, the stellar pattern alone was a little bit of a long shot, of course, but what was really a long shot was the fact that it doesn't rain on Mars. In fact, it is pretty much impossible for it to ever rain on Mars. And yet, when the Emperor arrived on Mars, not only did he do so in precisely the right spot, at precisely the right time, but he also brought with him a deluge of rain.
Nice.
So the Emperor arrived during the precise circumstances prophetized for the Omnissiah, and thusly was mistaken for the Omnissiah. What a coincidence! And as if to add coincidence to coincidence, it simply just slipped the Emperor's mind to clarify this whole thing. Whoops. It's almost as if he had planned it that way. And indeed, later on in the book, we're gonna see that that is precisely what he did. Sneaky little bastard he is. And also, another interesting little thing. So, he touches a knight, and just by touching it and saying, "Machine, heal thyself," fixes its wonky leg joint. The Emperor quite literally talked a machine into fixing itself. That seems rather magical, and certainly would have added a fair bit of fuel to the supposed fire that he was indeed the Omnissiah returned. And in a way, I think he was. I suspect the Omnissiah is entirely a creation of the Emperor's own designs. As we will see later on in the book, I don't think there is such a thing as the Omnissiah, but we'll get to that later on. The fact remains that now that the Emperor had shown up on Mars in exactly the same position, in exactly the same time frame, and doing the exact things necessary to prove that he was indeed sparkly machine god, he could now include Mars into the Imperium of Man without so much as a shot being fired, which was very, very important because at this point in time, the Imperium of Man essentially consisted of Terra, and that was pretty much it. The Emperor had some Astartes legions under his command, but they were a fairly pale shadow of what they would eventually become. There was, in other words, absolutely no guarantee that the Emperor could pacify Mars through a military campaign, seeing as the Mechanicus still, of course, had a rather considerable, monopoly on technology, shall we say. They had a lot of soldiers, they had a lot of very good soldiers, and the Emperor himself only had a relatively few numbers of Astartes, more than enough to pacify local warlords and minor rebelling factions on Terra, but to fight a full-scale war against Mars and the Mechanicus, well, he is still the Emperor, so maybe he could pull it off, but it would be difficult, it would take a long time, and in all due likelihood, the collateral damage to the industrial capabilities of Mars would be severe, which would kind of defeat the purpose of capturing the Red Planet in the first place. But by presenting himself as, quite literally, their god, he avoided all of that. So remember, children, whenever native savages asks you whether or not you are god, the answer is always yes. Yes, I am. And
unless they sacrifice their
it
gods.
turns out that already at this relatively early point in their history, the Mechanicus were a rather anal bunch when it came to their machines. As we can see throughout the books, they had essentially developed this religion of the Omnissiah, and everything working the way it did due to divine providence long before the rise of the Emperor. In fact, this seems to be something stemming all the way back to Old Night, which is rather interesting. This means that the Mechanicus never evolved into the organization they are today, but rather were created, or at the very least evolved directly into this religious organization from, what, settlers perhaps on the original planet of Mars? Factory workers, maybe? It's difficult to say, but it would appear that the Mechanicus has always more or less been the Mechanicus. And on that note, the Mechanicus sure have some pretty goddamn hard-ass rules, don't they? If you are caught or even suspected of, for example, modifying or improving or changing in any way upon a machine, the sentence is death. Dang, that's it's pretty harsh. Or, well, to be precise, the punishment isn't necessarily death. It can be death, but you could also simply be turned into a servitor, which is slightly worse than death, basically, as the process of turning a person into a servitor is basically lobotomizing them, removing all higher brain functions, and then programming in one or two simple tasks using the brain itself as a kind of rudimentary processor. It's a rather nasty fate, made even worse if you believe some of the rumors going around that servitors are not always necessarily entirely lobotomized. Ugh. Can you imagine a much worse fate than, they fuck up a little bit on the lobotomy. You are still conscious, but you have no control whatsoever over your own body, and so you're essentially just conducting one ridiculously repetitive and simple action for all eternity, like opening a fucking door, for example, for the next 10,000 years. Ugh. That shit's almost too dark even for 40 fucking K.
Yeah.
Jesus. Anyway, returning to the actual point, the Mechanicus views all mechanical items as religious paraphernalia. How should I explain this precisely? Basically, they think that the reason why a computer works is not because it is mechanically constructed to work. They don't think that a circuit works because you pass current through it. They believe that it works because the Omnissiah has granted it a portion of his divine spirit. In other words, a computer does not work because it is scientifically meant to function, in that it's set up in a logical fashion. It works because a portion of the Omnissiah's divine spirit lives within it, and if you piss off that spirit, the machine will simply cease functioning.
Wow.
And again, if something happens to be wrong with a machine, that has got nothing to do with its internal workings, electrical or mechanical or otherwise. It has to do with the machine's spirit. Now, this is, of course, the 41st millennium, and we do know that chaos has a rather considerable influence upon the real world, so it is not impossible that there is an element of truth in this belief, that a computer will function better with its divine spark being taken care of properly. But we also do know that in 40K, technology still works just like technology, but by that very same token, if you have an incredibly religious universe like 40K, and we know that if enough people believe in a thing, that thing will in fact be true due to how chaos works, that means that even if a computer is supposed to work, like there's nothing wrong with it mechanically or electronically, it might still not work because the person operating it believes that it will not work because of the fact that he hasn't provided it with the correct prayers or sacred unguents, for example.
Wow.
Additionally, maintenance is obviously kind of necessary
Just
to
like
keep
how
anything functioning for any
bolters and
span of time,
sacred
is also
relics.
done as a religious ritual. And I suspect this might be where we see the Mechanicus' earliest roots. Essentially, imagine a instruction manual. This instruction manual would, during the age of science, the golden age of technology, be used as just that, an instruction manual. It tells you that if this and this happens, you need to do this and this to fix it. During the time of the Mechanicus, they might find these and look upon them as religious text. Let's, for example, say that when the red flashes on this particular piece of machinery, what you need to do is remove the side panel and tighten the whatever the fuck. That's the technical manual. A very technical term, I know, the whatever the fuck. All machines have them. Generally speaking, you can bash them or kick them or do some other things and they'll generally function again. But anyway, so that's what the technical manual says. The Mechanicus would see that and go like, okay, so the red light flashing is the machine spirit saying that something is wrong inside, and it is there to bring attention to the fact that the whatever the fuck has not been properly cared to. And so, obviously, you need to apologize to the machine spirit because this is clearly your fault. So you need to open the side panel and you need to apologize to the machine spirit by burning some kind of sacred unguents, for example, giving it a little bit of a prayer, then tightening the whatever the fuck and putting on the side panel again. Again, making sure to apologize to the machine spirit and explaining that, you know, you're an incompetent moron and you're doing your best to fix it. I really find this really, really fascinating because I'm thinking, this is relatively plausible. Let's say you have an extremely advanced civilization. Then a huge apocalyptic event like Old Night happens, and you essentially get punted right on back to the Stone Age. If you essentially have a Bronze Age grasp of technology, then a computer will look like absolute fucking magic. And when you then have an instruction manual telling you how to operate and fix this magical device, I imagine it wouldn't be too much of a leap of logic for said Bronze Age person to go, well, clearly it must function because he has no way of understanding the internal workings of the machines. This is exactly the same reason why ancient man looked upon the sun and went, well, I have no idea how this giant ball of fire stays in the sky, and I have no idea how it moves across the heavens, so I'm going to impart my own logic upon that giant ball of fire. And since pretty much the most advanced thing I know of might be, for example, a cart or a chariot, then naturally, the giant ball of fire must be pulled by a chariot. Obviously. It's a really cool backstory, partially because I do believe it would actually be plausible. This might be a thing, like I said, that could happen. However, it's not exactly a friend to innovation, is it? When you have convinced yourself that all machines work because some divine entity deems it so, any kind of innovation undoubtedly would be, well, heresy. How the fuck would you, a normal human, know how to improve upon the divine? That's ridiculous. And this is precisely what happened within the Mechanicus, although not in all sectors of the Mechanicus. The majority of the Mechanicus still viewed this with a view to the mystical, shall we say. Most of them thought that the Omnissiah was at the very least a thing, and what really varied between the various factions was the degree to which they thought that the Omnissiah was responsible for something working. We will later on be introduced to Adept Seth, which has a rather different view on this, but there were definitely factions on Mars that still understood that technology was a thing that functioned because it was technology, rather than some kind of divine intervention. It's hard to tell exactly what kind of power balance we can see here. We know that the Fabricator General, in all due likelihood, is not one of them. He seems like a fairly ardent supporter of, perhaps not the Omnissiah idea in and of itself, but he does not seem like someone who would consider innovation to be an actual thing. He seems to be the kind of person who thinks that knowledge is simply knowledge, and you can't find more knowledge. Like, you can't make a leap of logic to come to a conclusion on how something works. There is simply knowledge, and it exists as a framework, you know? We know how an automatic weapon functions. That's not because anybody figured out how to make it function. We only know that it functions because it functions. That would be how the Fabricator General views things. Then we have the more religious view on things, which states that things function not because they are necessarily just knowledge, but that it is because the Omnissiah says it functions, and therefore all knowledge must necessarily come from the Omnissiah, which again means that innovation is not really a thing. And then we have a third faction, who, while still being somewhat religious, are at the very least starting to think that maybe things work because of the way they are put together. Perhaps they function in a logical fashion, which would mean that if I understand how, for example, a computer functioned, I could then figure out how to make a better computer. Although even then, as I mentioned, there are some religious undertones. For example, they still do believe that knowledge might not necessarily be a logical function in and of itself. They simply think that knowledge is a thing that a human could achieve through the application of a logical process. That might be a little bit confusing though. Let me try and put it in a different way. Like the Fabricator General thinks that knowledge can only be discovered and not discovered by logical application of ideas, this group would think that knowledge is a thing that simply exists. So the knowledge to create an automatic weapon again is just a piece of knowledge. However, they think that they might be able to acquire said knowledge by making reasoned arguments. The internal mechanism works so and so, therefore, if I assume this and this, I could come to a conclusion that would lead me to a piece of knowledge, rather than that piece of knowledge being a result of logical thinking. Am I making sense here? I'm not entirely sure myself, to be honest, because this is a rather complex thing. I feel like I should make a goddamn chart for this, but I'm too lazy. And hey, it makes the Mechanicus sound a lot more interesting if we just don't understand what the fuck the little screwheads are actually thinking. And speaking of those very same cog fetishists, we also get a little bit of interesting information about Mechanicus, Mars itself. For example, we get a little bit of information on how the planet actually runs. There's a mention of vassal forges tied to a huge power station, suggesting a near feudal system of governments exists between the various Mechanicum masters. Basically, the masters of a forge would be the masters of several power stations, whilst the power stations will in turn provide their energy to smaller forges, which will then provide their raw materials and worked goods to the larger forges. Essentially, it would appear as if the bigger your forge, the more important you are within Mechanicus society. And naturally, the bigger the forge, the more subsidiaries you have, the more vassal forges and power stations. It seems like a rather interesting hierarchical system, where your power within society is determined primarily by the amount of industrial capabilities you're sitting on. I imagine this would also mean that you are not necessarily judged by your industrial output, but rather how much industrial output you can aid in creating. So for example, somebody who runs a really, really big power station might be considered to be on the same footing as someone who owns a really, really big forge, because at the end of the day, one provides industrial output to the other, and is therefore at the very least partially responsible for said industrial output. The forges can't run without the power stations, and the power stations can't actually produce finished goods without the forges. And these various institutions are then linked together through hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, of mutually beneficial treaties, trade, and other various, how shall we say, agreements, perhaps? But on a greater scale, all of the various forges and power stations are in many cases their own mini-nations, would perhaps be a decent way of describing them. For example, a forge might have its own system of governance, although in all due likelihood it's going to be a fairly feudal system, with the forge master, the adept, being on the top, and then being served by various smaller dignitaries and officials, essentially acting as nobles, and below all of this you would have, of course, the serfs, the working class. And additionally, the various forges also maintain their own military formations, usually in the form of scitarii. And some of the larger forces might even have agreements with knights or titan legions to provide protection in return for example, reduced prices on worked goods, or perhaps indirect trade for said goods or other services. Let's for example say that a forge has specialized in the production and maintenance of knights. they might then create a mutually beneficial trade compact with an order of knights, where the knights will provide their military might in, for example, keeping the forge safe, strong-arming smaller forges, or conducting military actions on behalf of the forge. These could be guard duties, hunting missions to wipe out the various scavengers that scatter the planet of Mars, etc., etc. While in return, the forge will provide the knights not only with maintenance, but with spare parts and potentially even entirely new knights to replace those lost in action. I imagine all of this would result in a rather Byzantine system of governance, where the various forges will have ties to other forges, and due to these various ties, they will also be tied together diplomatically, politically, and in many cases even perhaps economically, where going to war with one forge might have a massive knock-on effect of dragging several other factions into that very same war. And I imagine this is one of the reasons why Mars has been a relatively peaceful planet. Again, we get notices throughout the book telling us that Mars has been pretty goddamn peaceful for a very, very long time, or well, peaceful, let me qualify that. There's plenty of skirmishes between the various forges, and even between the Titan legions. There's posturing, there's raids, there is, as I mentioned, minor skirmishes, and in fact, many of them even see this as a necessary part of maintaining a militaristic order. For example, in the books, we hear mentions of the Knights of Taranis having small skirmishes with other rivaling knightly orders. Now, whether or not these are outright quote-unquote wars, where both parties do their level best to kill the other party, is somewhat more unclear. I suspect that they might take the form of more ritualistic combat, because while both sides think that these minor skirmishes are necessary to maintain the level of their warriors, I don't think the Mechanicus would be particularly fond of losing war machines just due to the fact that these various military orders want to keep their eye in, so to say. So I would imagine that these skirmishes might take the form of kind of ritualized combat, where both of the parties will be firing at each other with the full intent of defeating and potentially killing the opposition, but the moment somebody either becomes incapable of combat, begins withdrawing, or perhaps sends out a signal via the open Vox network saying they surrender, for example, then that party will be considered to be a non-combatant, etc. That is purely speculation, but again, considering the fact that Mechanicus is not too fond of just losing machines for no reason, I would imagine that would be a decent compromise between the various warrior orders wanting to keep their skills in check by fighting equally skilled opponents, while still not unnecessarily losing valuable war machines. Moving on, we now get a couple of interesting little tidbits. First and foremost, we have a mention of the Furious Abyss, which I find rather interesting, because wasn't that supposed to be a secret? Granted, this is revealed to us through one of the servants of Adept Seth, who might have just a really, really good spy network. But considering the fact that the Fabricator General was willing to destroy an entire forge complex, in fact, an entire orbiting shipyard, to keep the existence of the Furious Abyss a secret, I imagine this is not common knowledge. I would imagine that this is a piece of information that Seth has managed to wheedle out of some other Mechanicus master, for example, an adept maybe, or perhaps something she has simply just stolen, a piece of information she has spied out by hacking into somebody else's computer network, for example. And here's the thing, even if Adept Seth knew that the Furious Abyss would be the largest ship ever, she would have absolutely no reason to suspect any kind of nefarious actions. It would just be an interesting little tidbit. She might go like, I wonder why this is kept so secret. Surely this would be a prestigious thing for the forge in question. But, you know, there are 1,000 reasons why that might be. Perhaps the guy making it just wants to reveal it in a grandiose fashion and go like, look what I built in my backyard. So again, there could be 1,000 different reasons, and she almost certainly would not at any point think to herself, I am wondering if this massive ship is being built for the word-bearers for the express purpose of beating the shit out of the Ultramarine. Because again, the very idea of Legion versus Legion warfare was considered to be, well, impossible, basically, so even if she knew that the Furious Abyss was being built, there was absolutely no way she could possibly leap to the conclusion that it was the opening gambit in a civil war. And speaking of Adept Seth, she has a rather interesting little theory herself. She postulates that parts of the Adeptus Mechanicus might be clinging to the idea of religion in the form of the Omnissiah, not because they actually believe in the Omnissiah, but because they see that as a weapon. As long as they can keep technology to this mystical art, then they can keep a monopoly on it. Because after all, they are the only ones who can understand the mystical arcane arts of machining. Whilst if everyone suddenly realized that, well, a computer works because it is a computer, and not because of divine spark, then a lot more people might think, I could probably build one. And that would unsurprisingly result in a fair bit of competition for the Mechanicus. Now, I am a little bit interested in seeing how the Emperor might feel about this, because we know the Emperor has been around for a very, very long time, and he was also around during the Golden Age of technology. In other words, the Emperor knows how machines work. He understands that there is nothing necessarily mystical about them, and yet he seems to at the very least humor the Mechanicus when it comes to the Omnissiah. Now, of course, in part, that is because of the fact that he needs them to believe that he is the Omnissiah, and therefore not resist his rule. But I imagine that this would be a part of a long-term plan. I am thinking that the moment that the Emperor has got full control over the galaxy, he is going to turn on the Mechanicus, seeing as that would be the natural next step. He's trying to wipe out all religion, and yet he's tolerating this religion within his Imperium. Now, the reason why is obviously because he needs the Mechanicus, but I would not be at all surprised if he would turn upon them, or perhaps not militarily. What I think he is planning is that once he has a chokehold on the galaxy, he will then start encouraging various forms of innovation within the Mechanicus, hoping that the superstitious elements will simply just disappear over the course of hundreds, possibly even thousands of years, as those religious elements will be outcompeted by the branches of the Mechanicus willing to innovate, and therefore, in all due probability, create superior items of technology.
Makes sense.
Nevertheless, that is a bit more speculation into the future. I do believe that Adept Seth's hypothesis is pretty close to the mark, but I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Certainly, I think that there are elements of the Mechanicus that use these religious undertones as a way to monopolize knowledge, but I am also pretty damn sure that there are considerable forces within the Mechanicus who genuinely do believe that the Omnissiah is a real thing. Whether or not they believe the Emperor is the Omnissiah, well, opinion appears to be split on that matter, with some believing quite firmly that yes, he is the Omnissiah, and others thinking that he is simply just pretending to be the Omnissiah, which, interestingly enough, might be precisely what the Emperor is doing. Remember, children, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And speaking of shadowy conspiracies, so we already know that Mars is not particularly peaceful with plenty of skirmishes, etc. But nobody wants an out-and-out shooting war to take place on Mars. That wouldn't really be to anyone's benefit.
No, not
As
at
such,
all.
there are mechanics to avoid that. One of which we get a look at in the book. A council where various Titan legions and knightly orders were all brought together in the hopes of finding some kind of compromise, whereas they could compromise on territorial borders, access to forges, energies, natural resources, etc., etc. In this case, it would appear that the two Titan legions of Mortis and Tempestus have been getting rather, hot and heavy, shall we say. The provocations have been coming thick and fast lately, and as such a conclave was called to try and resolve the differences. But that was not what happened at all. In fact, Legio Mortis practically straight up and outright declares its allegiance for Horus first and Imperium second, even going so far as to suggest that Mars has been somehow betrayed by the Emperor and that the War Master was coming to free Mars from the yoke of Imperial tyranny. And now again, as I mentioned, minor skirmishes and occasionally even outright engine battles did happen, but this is something quite outside the ordinary. To be entirely honest, I'm surprised that nobody simply just shot the Principe of Legio Mortis right then and there. He is pretty much outright stating that he is in the process of betraying the Emperor and rebelling against the Imperium at large. I am actually kind of shocked that nobody just pulled their sidearm and went like, okay then, plaff, problem solved. But sadly, nobody had the bright idea to simply shoot the bad guy as he laughed maniacally. Idiots. Oh well, to be entirely honest, they were probably just as shocked as everyone else and were just kind of sitting there gaping like, what the? Why would you? You know we could just shoot you, right? As he wonders out, twirling his mustache. Oh. And then we skip over to something completely goddamn different. So, Adept Seth. She has found herself a wonder child. Now again, the Mechanicus doesn't quite understand that whole innovation thing. And even though Adept Seth is far more free-spirited than most, she also doesn't quite understand how that works. So she has found herself a little wonder child by the name of Dahlia, a true autist who has a miraculous gift for simply just understanding how things work and could potentially work better. Now, in the eyes of Adept Seth, this is not Dahlia's brain being special. Rather, this is Dahlia being able to, on some mystical, magical level, being able to tap into the Immaterium, the warp, and directly into the Omnissiah himself, the wellspring of all knowledge. Now, personally, I think that she's probably just a real, good old-fashioned autist, rather than some kind of latent psychic creature, but hey, let us not abuse poor little Seth of that particular notion. And she decides to test her little new pet by having her build the Akashic Reader. Apparently this was some kind of heretical device dreamt up ages ago by some maniac who figured that if he made a fancy-ass helmet, he could tap into the wellspring of all knowledge, the warp itself, the Immaterium, and this isn't necessarily impossible. Again, let's remember here, the warp is whatever you make it. It can literally be anything and everything. It can be a still pond of luscious wonderfulness and relaxation, or a raging maelstrom of teeth and violent rape. It can be quite literally anything. So if you strap a guy into a chair, put a fancy-ass hat on his head, tell him that this will allow him to tap into the wellspring of all knowledge, and then pass a bajillion gigawatts through his skull, there is a decent chance that he might actually come up with something. Or get turned into barbecue. Either way, you win. On the other hand, though, considering the fact that I already know the true nature of the Omnissiah, and it will be revealed later on in this very book, I'm wondering if tapping into that particular Omnissiah might be a remarkably bad idea, because the technology you might come back with might not be of the, shall we say, wholesome kind, but we'll have to wait and see on that. But before we get to whether or not that is a very bad idea, we get something considerably more interesting. A nice little look into the War Master's plans for the Mechanicus. His original agreement with Kerbor Hal, the fabricated general, was that the Master of Mars would prioritize shipments of arms and armor to the expeditions the War Master most favored, whilst providing unfortunate delays and sad happenstances for those he did not. Additionally, the War Master was to directly support the War Master once he opened his rebellion full tilt. However, he did not ask them to do so openly. Essentially, any Mechanicus world that fell within the purview of the War Master or under his direct control or sphere of influence would simply just quietly and calmly switch from producing stuff for the Imperium to the War Master without openly declaring for him. However, Horus had changed his plans. He now wanted the Mechanicus to openly declare for the War Master, and therefore revolt alongside him. And therefore he wanted Kerbor Hal to secure Mars in the War Master's name immediately upon the War Master's rebellion becoming common knowledge. By doing this, he would make damn sure that there were no going back for Kerbor Hal. Because here's the thing, Horus already knew that the fabricated general was willing to betray the Emperor. and considering how long he had been pretending to be loyal to the Emperor, he was clearly a shifty little motherfucker, and as such there was absolutely no guarantee that he wouldn't betray Horus as well.
Sense.
However, if he got him to declare for Horus and brand himself a rebel by attacking his rival factions on Mars, that would rather irrevocably brand him as a traitor to the Imperium, and therefore secure his own star quite securely to that of Horus. If Horus fell, so too did the Fabricated General. But this was, as you can probably imagine, a pretty goddamn major ask. To begin with, the Fabricator General had all the cards. If Horus was to fall, he could simply just feign ignorance and blame various logistical hiccups on why the Loyalist legions were out of supply for so long, while reaffirming his loyalty to the God Emperor. However, if he was to comply with the War Master's demands, he would be well and truly committed. And considering the fact that Mars in and of itself was a rather militaristic place, there was no guarantee he would be able to overcome the various other factions on Mars, even with the advantage of surprise. Secondly, Mars, of course, is very close to Terra, and far more importantly, Terra's garrison of Imperial Fists, an entire legion of the Emperor's finest, well within striking distance of Mars. That was a rather considerable danger. And so, to sweeten the deal, Horus came bearing gifts, or more precisely, his diplomatic advisors did. He offered the Mechanicus several STC constructs that he had stolen from the Technocracy. A valuable prize indeed, but not quite enough to declare himself an open rebel, not this close to Terra. And Horus was no fool. This was just to get Mars interested. The real clincher was the Vaults of Moravec. They had been sealed by the Emperor when he first arrived on Mars. In fact, it had been one of the first things he did. He headed straight into the Noctus Labyrinthus, the Labyrinth of Old Night, an area of Mars that had remained almost entirely unexplored due to strange tech phenomena. Anyone who entered there would not be finding his way out again, regardless of how advanced his augurs and surveys are. However, the Emperor, with the Fabricated General in tow, wandered straight up to the vaults as if he had been there as early as yesterday. Now, the vaults themselves were quite famous. The man who had created them was a rather infamous apostate. He had resided on Terra during the Dark Age, where various local warlords were fighting over resources and control over Terra. Moravec had been experimenting on things that were less than entirely ethical, shall we say. There was definitely a certain chaos tinge to many of his experiments. He was also, by the way, one of the founders of the cult of the Omnissiah, and he had apparently created some rather demonic toys. However, a lot of this knowledge had been lost, and these days his vaults was thought to simply just be a massive treasure trove of lost knowledge. Again, the Mechanicus had no real understanding of chaos, or the warp in general. They simply just saw it as forbidden knowledge. And any forbidden knowledge is, of course, the exact type of knowledge that you really want. But to the Fabricator General's shock, the Emperor had paused outside the vaults for several minutes, keeping his massive hands upon the door deep in deliberation, before turning back to his entourage and saying that they would leave the vaults unopened. When the Fabricator General protested, the Emperor ordered him to strike any recordings he might have made of the route they had taken, and also delete any form of information, memory, or otherwise stored in his databanks, which outraged the Fabricator General. He claimed that the Mechanicus never deleted anything, but the Emperor told the Fabricator General that if he did not agree to this, then the compact between Mars and Terra would be over, and the Emperor would bring down the full might of his legions upon Mars. And far more importantly, he would be bringing down his own massive golden fists upon the ever so small and squishy Fabricator General right in front of them. And as such, he agreed. Although he tried to squirrel away some secret recordings, but, well, the Emperor's servants are very, very good at their jobs. And when the Fabricator General tried to retrieve the data, he found that it had already been wiped. This, unsurprisingly, left the Fabricator General somewhat miffed. But honestly, he should be praising his lucky star that he didn't have his memory coils deleted via the usage of rounds rather than the more subtle usage of 40K's version of CC Cleaner. Surprisingly merciful of the Emperor, if you ask me. If I was Big E in this particular circumstance, I would have cured Kerebor Hal of his misgivings via the application of a power fist to his face. And that probably would have been the superior option, because it turns out the people who record everything are pretty damn good at holding grudges. And now that the War Master's envoy had delivered Hal a perfect opportunity to not only enrich himself and gain some valuable knowledge, but also flip the bird to the Big E down on Terra, he simply could not resist. Not to mention, of course, that even at this point, while it might be possible for Hal to turn around and try and pretend that everything that had happened so far was merely coincidences and he had not really been in contact with the War Master, well, the odds of pulling that off were less than sterling, shall we say.
Just a bit.
With the full knowledge that at this point he had probably come too far to turn around anyways, and considering the sweet, sweet nectar of the pot that the War Master had presented him with, the compact between the Mechanicus and the War Master was complete. Unfortunately for the traitorous little rat bastard, however, others had started to suspect misdoings. The Fabricator Locum, a post that essentially means that he's an assistant of sort to the Fabricator General, and, if worse comes to worst, an emergency replacement that would himself be replaced as soon as a suitable candidate was found, had noticed some rather severe supply problems. Problems that were far outside the realms of usual operation. Several of the Emperor's legions were experiencing very, very marked supply shortages. The Salamanders reported that several of their expeditions were using their emergency reserves produced by their accompanying forge ships, something that was virtually unheard of. And the Fabricator Locum began suspecting that something was very, very wrong. There seemed to be such a ridiculous amount of happenstance and accidental incidents that simply could not be explained away by the usual human factor. And to further compound the curious nature of this particular case, it would appear that irrespective of their distance to Mars or other Forge worlds, the legions that appeared to be the closest in allegiance to the War Master were suffering no supply problems, while those who were currently awaiting orders or otherwise non-engaged by the War Master were experiencing severe supply deficits. This did not add up. After all, you would think that the longer a supply line gets, the harder it would be to maintain, and yet in quite a few cases here, the opposite would seem to be the case. And so he decided to take his findings to the Fabricator General. Well, shit. Nice knowing you, Fabricator Locum. I'm sure no one will actually miss you. But, Fabricator Locum's grisly demise notwithstanding, let us return once again to Adept Seth and her Akashic Reader. So, Dahlia had managed the impossible and created the Akashic Reader. I would like to touch upon this because all of it sounds rather, heretical, shall we say. So, a golden throne and all that. In all due likelihood, however, this has little to do, or in fact probably nothing to do, with the Golden Throne, which at this point was already more or less completed back on Terra. It is unclear, however, if the design might be similar, or perhaps Big E used the same design that Dahlia had so recently created for Adept Seth. It is possible that the Emperor's Golden Throne was essentially an Akashic Reader of some sort. However, I would consider that to be relatively unlikely, considering the stated purpose of the Golden Throne was to operate the Eldar's Webway network, or at the very least a version of it, and to amplify the psychic powers of whoever sat upon it. I don't think this is necessarily a reference to one or the other. I think these are two very, very separate devices with rather separate goals. I could be incorrect on that, but I do believe that it's probably just a coincidence that both of them are golden. Or perhaps it has symbolic value. After all, the kings of old sat upon golden thrones, and within the warp, symbolic value has a lot of real value. And as such, it is entirely possible that the ludicrous display of wealth that a solid gold throne would be, and therefore, of course, a show of power, might actually translate into a tangible effect in the warp. Basically, having a giant gold chair will in some way empower you inside the Immaterium. It's far from impossible. However, it turns out that all of these preparations were somewhat for naught. All of the careful planning and careful construction that Dahlia had put into creating the Akashic Reader, and all of the work that Adept Seth had created in building the entire goddamn thing, placing a couple hundred, if not thousands of psychics into glass jars, and selecting one psychic individual to try and focus them all to enter the Immaterium and tap into the wellspring of all knowledge, and all of this was undone due to the simple fact that Adept Seth, despite all evidence to the contrary, is a fucking moron. I simply have no other words to adequately describe the sheer idiocy of what happens next. You see, she wants to power the Akashic Reader by tapping into the Astronomicon, the most powerful source of psychic energy in the God Emperor damned galaxy. And for some mystical and majestical reason, she figured that her chief designer Dahlia didn't need to know about this particular little tidbit about knowledge. After all, what could possibly go wrong? Essentially, what she is trying to do here is pass a nuclear power plant's worth of energy through a 12-volt breaker. Except in this case, the breaker is a remarkably fucked psyker. I simply lack the language to describe just how utterly and beyond belief butt-fucked this poor little bastard is. There are big fluffy-butted convicts in American prison showers right now that just dropped the soap, and yet do not even approach the levels of buttfuckery this poor sod is about to experience. The main performer in Gay Men in Boots 7 has not even come within a galactic mile of the kind of root-filling this unsuspecting white boy is about to live through. The great football rape of Brazil in 2014 cannot even compare. The election night murder of Hillary Clinton's hopes and dreams was but the palest imitation of the horrors about to descend on this man's rump. And then, Seth flipped the fucking switch. And an entire galaxy's worth of psychic energy shaped in the form of a brutally large dong descended upon this poor bastard's brain cavity. The results were as predictable as they were horrifying. Obviously, the sad psychic soul in the middle of the room is getting violated in ways not even physically nor psychically possible in our plane of existence, but additionally, Adept Seth had now passed the full power of the bloody Astronomicon throughout her entire electrical grid, getting within an hair's breadth of making the entire Magma City go woomph, and deleting about 600 square kilometers of Martian surface. Luckily, Adept Idiot had at the very least had the foresight to install an oh fuck switch that cut power to the rest of the Magma City, avoiding, at least for the moment, an apocalyptic explosion that would send Adept Moron in a steady orbit around Venus.
Nice.
Although it should be mentioned that this whole experiment did have some fortuitous side effects, although I would like to point out that that was in no way an actual part of Adept Nitwit's plans. And what was that fortuitous event, you might ask? Well, you can recognize a cliffhanger just as well as I can, and this seems like a suitably dramatic moment to end this particular video, to make sure that you'll actually come back for the next one. So, until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. After all, it's not like you have a choice. Have a good day.
You too, Arch. Okay, so that was Arch Warhammer's Mechanicum, part of the Horus Heresy lore breakdown series. If you are interested in checking out more of Arch's stuff, I'm sure he would enjoy the extra support. There is a link in the description to help you find him. This was also requested by CJ Falcon. Thank you for requesting it. Quite interesting stuff is happening here. So, Emperor lands on Mars, and it talks about that. It also talks about how he came in just the way that he might be mistaken as the Omnissiah, even bringing rain to a planet that's incapable of raining. Apparently they had been a religious group, even with signs of being religious towards mechanical things, since the beginning of being on the moon, or being on Mars. It touched on servitors and how bad that could be for breaking such rules, and how strict they were. It also talked about the spirit, Omnissiah's spirit they believed was partially in all equipment. It talked about the power stations and the different forges and how they spread across, and what kind of leadership, militaries, and ties they had to things like the Knights and Titans. There's even a mention of the Abyss, possibly through a spy that Seth had. She also had a theory that perhaps the religious belief was more so they could keep a monopoly. Anyone who strays from it is killed, and the only people who can take care of the technology is through this faith. And so that's them. They're the only ones approved to do it, because it involves all the extra steps. But it also talks about, or Arch talks about, this world has the warp. And when you believe something enough, and there's enough people believing similar, if not same things, or experiencing such emotions, similar if not the same, it can create entities. It's like, my favorite description of this is, I can't remember who it was from, but it talked about how orcs had large machines that for all intents and purposes, they were incapable of moving themselves. Like, no physical way to drag themselves across the ground. And yet, the orcs had such faith in these machines as they built them, these monstrosities with phallic objects painted and welded to them, that it would just get up and move. And it's like, with no physical means of actually doing that, how does it do that? You know, it's the reality that this world, if you have the faith, can pull off some crazy, weird, sometimes amazing, sometimes horrifying things. But apparently, apparently the Titans Mortis and Tempest have gathered together to try to quell some of their rivalry and their issues with their border. And it sounds like it was at that point that Mortis declares loyalty to Horus and even goes as far as denying the Imperium. Ooh, that's a bad, bad step. Apparently, at this point, Seth had found herself this amazingly talented gal named Dahlia, had her build a reader of sorts, which somehow is similar to the Golden Throne in the concept that it is gold, but has doesn't seem to have much ties other than that. And she foolishly tries to tie it and power it by all these psychics force-fed through the Astronomicon. And so it pretty much destroyed them, but apparently it's leading to something good happening. But the talks about how the War Master had a contract or had worked out a deal with the Master Fabricator, and how he was originally just making sure that Horus's people got fed, and that the Imperium's guys were accidentally not fed enough, supplied enough, if you will. But it came to the point that Horus was now of the opinion that you either need to join us now or don't join us, or you're going down kind of attitude. Which there was a point where the Emperor had come to Mars and had sealed off this very important, potentially powerful, or maybe reverse that, very powerful, potentially important set of vaults that were full of mystic past stuff from an event they call the Old Night. And this irritated the Fabricator, and so he was more than willing to join Horus completely, just to spite the Emperor, if you will. Meanwhile, the assistant had started noticing many shortages and odd things going on, like Horus's men being supplied and the Imperium's not so favored men being shorted, which probably ends up leading to his death. Anyways, so it ends with this golden reader and all these psychics dying in a horrific, horrible death. And that's what we learned from this piece. There is a part 2 coming up, so we'll have to check that out. Very, very interesting stuff. The Mars stuff, you know, you don't touch on it too much, but there's a lot of interesting concepts here of people worshiping technology. That could go many interesting places. Anyways, I think I'm going to leave it there. So, till next time, Willie, out.
If you liked the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to leave a comment. Have a good one. Looks like we're back.